In the frozen skies over Germany, a dying American bomber locked eyes with the enemy pilot who should have killed him, yet saved him instead. For 40 years, the American searched for the ghost who spared his life. What he found wasn't an enemy, it was family. By 1943, the air war over Europe had become one of the most dangerous campaigns of the Second World War. The United States 8th Air Force, operating from bases across England, was carrying out daylight bombing operations deep into German territory, a strategy intended to destroy the industrial capacity of the Third Reich. The cost of that strategy was staggering. Loss rates on some missions reached more than 20%, and for many bomber crews, survival felt less like probability and more like chance. Airmen spoke openly of coin flip missions, acknowledging that every sortie could be the one that ended their lives. Life inside a B-17 Flying Fortress was harsh even before the enemy appeared. The aircraft operated at altitudes where temperatures dropped to -40 or -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Heated flight suits malfunctioned regularly, oxygen masks froze, and the metal surfaces inside the bomber became so cold that touching them with bare skin could cause instant frostbite. For Wright cyclone engines produced a continuous, bone-deep roar. Communication relied on intercom systems that were easily damaged, leaving crew members to work in near-deafening noise while performing tasks that required absolute coordination. As bomber formations approached the European coastline, anxiety inside each aircraft increased. Navigators recalculated courses, bombardiers checked their equipment, and gunners scanned the skies for dots that might turn into German fighters. Below them lay northern Germany, heavily protected by anti-aircraft guns, radar networks, and Luftwaffe interceptor units. For the crews, crossing into this airspace meant entering what many called the flak belt, a zone where survival depended on timing, luck, and the ability of the formation to maintain cohesion under fire. Flak was the first threat most crews encountered. German 88mm batteries lined the approaches to industrial cities, firing timed fuse shells that exploded in dense patterns. Veterans described the black bursts as clouds of steel fragments, large enough to tear through control cables, fuel lines, and human bodies in an instant. Entire bombers were seen breaking apart from direct hits, falling in flames or spinning into the ground. Even near misses were enough to cripple an aircraft or wound the crew. Beyond the flak raids, the Luftwaffe posed a second, equally lethal, dangered fighter units flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s waited for bomber formations emerging from the flak zones. They targeted stragglers, damaged aircraft, and those that drifted out of formation. Their attacks were coordinated and relentless. For many American crews, the sight of German fighters closing in at high speed was one of the most frightening moments of the mission. Into this environment stepped Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown. At 21 years old, he was part of the new generation of pilots arriving in Europe as the air campaign intensified. He had completed his training in the United States only months earlier, before being assigned to the 379th Bomb Group at RAF Kimbolton. Despite his youth and limited combat experience, he carried full responsibility as the aircraft commander of AB-17. 10 men depended on his decisions and leadership. Brown's bomber, Ye Old Pub, was crewed mostly by young, relatively inexperienced airmen. Like thousands of others serving in the 8th Air Force, they learned the realities of combat not from training manuals, but from the missions themselves. They absorbed the routines of early morning briefings, formation takeoffs, and long hours spent climbing to altitude. Yet nothing fully prepared them for the combination of cold, fear, and sudden violence that defined operations over Germany. By late 1943, it had become clear to many crews that the air war was not a simple confrontation of good and evil. It was a struggle shaped by industrial objectives, strategic doctrines, and the experiences of young men pushed to their limits. For Charlie Brown and his crew, the mission they were about to fly would bring them face to face with those realities in a way few could have anticipated, an encounter that would challenge the idea of what an enemy truly was. The target on December 20, 1943, was the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, one of the most important industrial sites in northern Germany. The facility produced components for the Fw-190, the Luftwaffe's primary single-engine fighter, and disrupting its output was a strategic priority. The Germans protected it accordingly. The approaches to Bremen were lined with some of the densest concentrations of 88mm flak batteries in the region. supported by radar stations and fighter units positioned to intercept the bombers. As they exited the target zone. As the American formation neared the city, the sky ahead darkened with flak bursts. Crews described the barrage over Bremen as a wall of explosions. The timed fuse shells detonated in precise patterns, sending jagged steel fragments through the air at high velocity. Each burst filled the sky with black smoke and lethal shrapnel. Inside Ye Old Pub, the temperature had already fallen to dangerous levels. Frost covered the interior surfaces, and condensation froze on oxygen masks. The crew braced as the bomber entered the flak field. The first explosion struck near the nose of the aircraft. Shockwaves rattled the frame, and fragments shattered the plexiglass, sending a blast of sub-zero wind into the cockpit. The sudden cold froze instruments, stiffened the controls, and made breathing more difficult. Blood from the wounded mixed with frost, hardening instantly on clothing and metal surfaces. A second burst hit closer, tearing through the fuselage and severing hydraulic lines. Brown's co-pilot was wounded, and the engineer was hit by shrapnel. The aircraft's oxygen system partially failed, forcing the crew to fight the early effects of hypoxia. Moments later, engine number 2 took a direct hit and failed completely. Engine number 4 began leaking oil and vibrating violently, threatening to tear itself from the wing, with the bomber already struggling to maintain altitude. The loss of power made holding formation nearly impossible. The guns in several positions froze, leaving the aircraft with limited defensive capability. In the ball turret, ice had jammed the mechanism, rendering it useless. Under normal circumstances, a damaged B-17 could rely on the protection of the formation. But as Ye Old Pub lost speed, it began to drift backward. Charlie Brown fought the controls, but the wounded aircraft continued to fall behind. The flak barrage intensified, and every second outside the formation increased the danger. Within minutes, the bomber was alone, separated from the group, descending, and barely controllable. The crew faced the most feared situation of the air war, a solitary, crippled aircraft over hostile territory, exposed to approaching German fighters. In this condition, Ye Old Pub was no longer a functioning combat machine. It had become, in the words many crews used for such aircraft, a dead man flying. Separated from the formation and losing altitude, Ye Old Pub became the very target German fighter doctrine was designed to exploit. Luftwaffe pilots referred to damaged, isolated bombers as Abschussreif, ready to be shot down. Radar stations near Bremen quickly detected the straggler, and within minutes, fighters were airborne to finish the job. The first to arrive were Focke-Wulf FW-190s, approaching in disciplined, coordinated formations. German tactics emphasized head-on attacks, where the closing speed was greatest, and the chance of a decisive hit was highest. The fighters swept in with precision, firing 20mm cannon shells that tore through the already damaged airframe. The first pass shattered control surfaces and riddled the wings with holes. For the crew inside, the impact felt like continuous hammer blows striking the metal skin of the aircraft. The tail section, already weakened by flak, became the primary target. During one of the opening attacks, a cannon shell exploded directly into the tail gunner's position. The blast killed the gunner instantly, severing his communication line and leaving the tail defenses silent. His position, coated in frost and blood, remained motionless as the fighters circled for another pass. With the tail guns gone, the bomber's most important defensive angle was wide open. As the attacks continued, the waist gunners attempted to respond, but their guns were freezing in the extreme cold. One waist gunner was wounded by fragments as cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. Another crewman collapsed near the radio compartment after being hit by debris. Blood spread across the floor, freezing almost immediately on the metal panels. Oxygen masks stiffened with ice, making breathing difficult and communication uneven. In the cockpit, Charlie Brown struggled to maintain control. The bomber's damaged engines produced uneven thrust, causing the aircraft to yaw violently. The controls felt heavy, partly from hydraulic failures and partly from Brown's growing fatigue. His co-pilot, already wounded, drifted in and out of consciousness. With each hit, Brown fought to keep the wings level, knowing that a stall or uncontrolled dive would send the crew to their deaths. The German fighters regrouped for another coordinated attack. They moved with the discipline of a force that had spent years defending the airspace over northern Germany. One pilot attacked from below, another from the front, and others from the rear, each intended to deliver the final blows that would tear the bomber apart. The B-17 structure groaned under the strain, Control cables frayed, sections of the fuselage peeled open, and smoke drifted through the interior. At this point, the aircraft was only moments from destruction. By any rational measure, ye old pub should not have remained airborne. It was a crippled bomber, surrounded by experienced Luftwaffe pilots, shedding altitude, losing power, and carrying wounded men who could barely defend themselves. Its survival now depended not on strength or firepower, but on something far more, uncertain whether the next burst of cannon fire would be the one that finally ended its flight. Franz Stigler was already an accomplished Luftwaffe fighter pilot by December 1943. Born in Bavaria and trained as a commercial airline aviator before the war, he transitioned into military flying, with the skill and discipline that made him one of the most respected pilots in his unit. By the time he was stationed near Bremen, he had accumulated dozens of combat missions and 27 confirmed victories in the skies over North Africa, Italy, and Germany. His reputation was that of a determined but measured fighter, aggressive in combat but not reckless. Stigler's outlook on warfare had been shaped early in his career by his commanding officer, Gustav Rettel. Rettel, a respected veteran from the early years of the war, enforced a strict code of conduct among his pilots. He told them repeatedly that their humanity must survive the brutality of aerial combat. One rule became a defining principle for Stigler: if I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. Rettel's message was clear: victory was important, but honor mattered more. The war had already touched Stigler on a personal level. Earlier that year, his younger brother August, also a Luftwaffe pilot, had been killed in action. Franz continued flying, but the loss weighed heavily on him. He often spoke later about how August's death changed his perception of the enemy. He no longer saw Allied pilots simply as opponents. He saw them as men with families, brothers, and futures that could disappear in a single moment of combat. On the day ye old pub limped away from Bremen, Stigler had just returned from a previous engagement. His aircraft was being refueled and rearmed when ground crews reported a lone American bomber flying low and heavily damaged. For any experienced pilot, this was considered an easy kill, a chance to secure another victory without serious risk. Stigler climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 109, took off, and quickly closed the distance. As he approached the bomber from behind, he prepared for the standard rear attack. But when he drew closer, the situation changed. Through the torn fuselage, he could see the interior of the B-17, something normally impossible in combat. The tail section was destroyed. The tail gunner lay dead beside his silent guns. The waist compartment was shredded, exposing wounded crewmen trying to help one another. The nose was blown open, the cockpit glass shattered, frost coating the controls and the pilots' faces. The sight stopped him. Training demanded he finish the kill. His duty, as a German officer in wartime, was to destroy enemy aircraft, but the condition of the men inside the B-17 triggered the conflict he had carried since losing his brother. He recognized immediately that these were not opponents engaged in combat. They were helpless survivors trapped in a machine barely holding together. In that moment, Stigler faced a choice between duty to the Luftwaffe and the code of honor that Rettel had instilled in him. What he saw inside the bomber was enough to make him decide that finishing the attack would not be an act of war, it would be an execution. And that, for Franz Stigler, was something he could not do. What unfolded next became one of the most improbable encounters of the entire air war. Instead of positioning his Bf 109 behind the American bomber for a final attack, Franz Stigler eased his fighter forward until he was flying almost level with the B-17's tail. He then moved closer, eventually sliding into a wingtip-to-wingtip position, something virtually unheard of in aerial combat. The two aircraft, enemies by every definition of wartime doctrine, now flew only a few yards apart. Inside ye old pub, the surviving crew members reacted with disbelief. The waist gunners, wounded and struggling to stay conscious, saw the distinctive silhouette of a Messerschmitt beside them, and prepared for the inevitable strike. With their guns frozen and ammunition nearly gone, there was nothing they could do. Charlie Brown, disoriented from injuries and the brutal cold pouring into the cockpit, heard a crewman shout a warning. When he looked left, he saw the German fighter maintaining formation close enough that he could see the pilot's face. Through the canopy, for several seconds, neither aircraft changed course. Communication systems were damaged, and there was no way to speak across the open air. Stigler relied on hand signals, hoping Brown would understand. First, He pointed downward, toward the ground, in an attempt to signal that the Americans should land immediately. In Stigler's view, a forced landing at a German airfield offered the best chance for medical treatment. Captivity was certain, but the wounded would live. Brown, however, rejected the gesture. To land in Germany meant surrender, and for some of the crew, it would mean abandoning the dead tail gunner and those too injured to move safely. Stigler tried a second signal. He pointed north, toward neutral Sweden. Many damaged bombers attempted to reach Swedish airspace to avoid both capture and the dangers of the North Sea. Again, Brown shook his head. Dazed and injured, he could think only of returning to England, no matter how distant or unlikely the prospect. At this point, Stigler understood that the American crew had made their choice. Despite the risks, they intended to attempt the long journey home. The German pilot then made a decision on his own. He maneuvered his fighter slightly ahead and to the side of the bomber, placing himself between the old pub and the German coastline. By doing so, he presented a visual signal to anti-aircraft crews along the ground. A German fighter escorting an American bomber generally meant a captured aircraft being guided to land. The flak batteries, interpreting the scene through that lens, held their fire across those 10 minutes of escort. Stigler periodically checked the bomber's condition. He could see Brown struggling to hold the controls steady. Frost coated the wounded crew. Parts of the fuselage vibrated violently as wind tore through open gaps. The B-17 was close to structural failure, yet it remained airborne, pushed forward by Brown's insistence on returning to friendly territory. When the aircraft finally reached the edge of the coast and crossed over the North Sea, Stigler knew he could proceed no farther. To follow the bomber into open water or toward British airspace would mean certain death. He pulled his Bf-109 closer one last time. For a moment, the two pilots, separated by national allegiance, language, and a global conflict, looked at each other across only a few feet of cold air. Stigler raised his right hand and delivered a slow, deliberate salute. It was not a gesture of victory or defiance. It was acknowledgement of skill, of survival, and of the shared experience of combat. With that final act, he broke formation, banked away, and disappeared back toward Germany. The bomber, now alone once more, flew on into the vast gray expanse of the North Sea, carrying a crew who had just witnessed an act that contradicted everything they had been told about the enemy. When the old pub finally crossed the English coastline and descended toward Raff Seething, its condition stunned everyone who saw it. The bomber's tail section was nearly gone. The nose was shattered, and parts of the fuselage were peeled open by cannon and flak. Only two engines were functioning properly, and one of them was leaking oil. As the aircraft touched down and rolled to a stop, ground crews rushed forward, expecting to pull only survivors or bodies from the wreckage. Instead, they found a battered but living crew emerging from a bomber that looked as if it should never have left the sky. Men on the ground examined the holes punched through the airframe, the frozen blood on the floors, and the remains of the tail gunner's position. One officer later commented that the aircraft appeared held together by little more than air and faith. The fact that it had stayed airborne across Germany and the North Sea seemed almost impossible. But the shock inside the debriefing room was different. Charlie Brown, exhausted and still affected by injuries and cold, recounted the mission, the flak, the fighters, the wounded, and the near loss of the aircraft. Then he explained the moment that none of the officers expected: the appearance of the German fighter, the escort, and the salute. Brown believed he was reporting a remarkable event, perhaps even an example of honor in the midst of brutality. The response was immediate and firm. Brown was told not to repeat the story, not to his crew, not to other pilots, not to anyone. The order came from a simple military calculation. The air war depended on clarity of purpose, on maintaining morale, and on ensuring that bomber crews saw the enemy as a threat that must be eliminated, without hesitation. Stories of mercy complicated that message. If airmen began to wonder whether the pilot on the other side might spare them, they might hesitate to fire. In daylight bombing, even a moment's hesitation could cost lives. Charlie obeyed the order, but the silence weighed on him. He had been saved by a man he could not name, whose gesture he could not acknowledge, and whom he would likely never see again. The inability to express gratitude, to recognize the humanity shown to him, became a private burden he carried long after the bomber was repaired and the mission logged. After completing his wartime service, Charlie Brown returned to the United States carrying more than the memory of a damaged bomber. He carried the unspoken weight of the mission over Bremen, though he resumed his life first through the G.Bill, then through service in the newly formed U.S. Air Force. He never fully escaped the experience inside Old Pub. The image of the German fighter beside him, the salute, and the order to remain silent followed him into civilian life. Over the years, the trauma surfaced in the form of recurring nightmares, sudden awakenings, and the persistent question of why he had been spared. Brown built a career, raised a family, and served with distinction, yet the secrecy surrounding that moment left a void he could not fill. Across the Atlantic, Franz Stigler faced a different, but equally isolating burden. Germany's defeat left the Luftwaffe shattered, and its surviving pilots navigating a devastated homeland. Stigler, already marked by the death of his brother and the destruction he had witnessed, chose to leave Europe. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada and began rebuilding his life as a civilian. He rarely discussed the war, and the incident involving the American bomber remained unspoken. In wartime Germany, sparing an enemy aircraft could have been considered treason. In post-war Germany, many Luftwaffe pilots faced suspicion or resentment. Stigler carried the memory privately, unsure whether the men he had helped had survived the journey across the North Sea. For decades, the two men lived separate lives, one in the United States, one in Canada, never knowing the fate of the other. Yet the same 10-minute encounter haunted them both. For Brown, it was the unanswered debt of gratitude. For Stigler, it was the uncertainty of whether his act of mercy had been meaningful. Neither man could let go of what had happened because neither had closure. The war had ended, but the memory of that moment remained alive in both of them, waiting for a day when silence would finally break. For more than 4 decades, Charlie Brown honored the wartime order to remain silent. The story stayed confined to his memories, resurfacing only in nightmares and moments of reflection. Everything changed in 1986 when he attended a gathering of former combat pilots in the United States. Surrounded by men who understood the realities of the air war, Brown finally felt compelled to speak. During a discussion about memorable missions, he recounted the Bremen raid and, for the first time in public, described the German fighter that spared his crew. The room fell silent. Fellow veterans urged him to search for the pilot, asking whether he had ever learned the man's name or fate. Brown realized that decades had passed without him ever attempting to find the one person who had changed his life. The search began with official avenues. Brown contacted the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency, hoping that mission reports or intelligence summaries might list German units active over Bremen that day. He wrote to the West German Air Force, asking whether surviving Luftwaffe archives contained relevant records. He reached out to historians, archivists, and former military personnel who might have access to wartime logs. Each inquiry returned the same result: missing documents, incomplete records, or files lost during the destruction of 1945. Some had been captured by the Soviets and remained behind the Iron Curtain, inaccessible during the Cold War. Months turned into years. Brown, now nearing 70, felt time closing in. The men who had fought in 1943 were aging rapidly. Many had already passed away. The possibility that the German pilot might have died without ever knowing the outcome weighed heavily on him. Yet Brown persisted, unwilling to accept that the trail had gone cold forever. In 1989, recognizing that formal channels had failed, he tried a final approach. He wrote a detailed account of the incident and sent it to newsletters read by former American and German pilots. His message was simple. He was searching for the Luftwaffe pilot who had spared Ye Old Pub. It was a last attempt and open call across 2 continents, hoping that someone, somewhere, might recognize the story and help identify the man who had once flown beside him in silence. In January 1990, Franz Stigler was living quietly in Vancouver when he received his regular copy of a combat pilot newsletter. As he read through the pages, one account stopped him cold. It described a crippled B-17 over Bremen, the dead tail gunner, the shattered nose, the frozen crew, and a German fighter flying beside it before offering a salute. Every detail matched the moment he had carried privately for decades. Stigler later said the recognition was immediate. There was no doubt in his mind. After 47 years, he had finally learned that the bomber had survived. The discovery stirred memories he had long kept buried. He remembered the decision not to fire, the sight of the wounded Americans, and the uncertainty that followed as he returned to base. The question that had troubled him for decades, whether the crew had made it home, was now answered. Without hesitation, He sat down and wrote a brief, direct letter dotted, contained for words that would change to lives. I was the one. When the envelope arrived in Miami, Charlie Brown recognized the Canadian postmark, but assumed it was another dead end. As he opened the letter, his hands shook. The message was short, almost unbelievable. Could this truly be the man he had spent years searching for? Doubt, disbelief, and hope collided in a single moment. The letter included a telephone number. Brown dialed it immediately. A German-accented voice answered. Brown introduced himself as the pilot of the B-17 spared near Bremen. There was a long pause, then Stigler spoke. He described what he had seen inside the bomber, the condition of the crew, and the final salute. Every detail aligned perfectly. Brown felt decades of silence and unanswered questions collapse at once. On opposite sides of the continent, two elderly men broke down in tears. After nearly half a century, they finally spoke the words they had both carried alone: gratitude, relief, and recognition of a moment that had defied the logic of war. 6 months after their first phone call, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler agreed to meet in Seattle. News crews were invited to document the reunion, recognizing the historical significance of the former enemies finding each other after nearly half a century. When Stigler stepped out of the car and saw Brown waiting, he did not hesitate. He moved quickly toward him, and the two men embraced as if reuniting with family rather than meeting for the first time. Cameras captured the moment Stigler rested an arm around Brown and said, with unmistakable sincerity, "I love you, Charlie." It was a statement shaped by decades of reflection and the recognition of a bond forged in the harshest circumstances of war. The meeting marked a turning point for Brown. For years he had endured recurring nightmares tied to the mission over Bremen, the freezing cockpit, the flak bursts, and the uncertainty that followed. After reconnecting with Stigler, the nightmares subsided. He later explained that finally knowing the identity of the man who spared him brought closure that had been missing since 1943. Stigler soon met other surviving members of the Ye Old Pub crew. Along with their families, he saw children and grandchildren who existed only because the bomber had made it home. The encounters reinforced the impact of his decision in a way he had never fully imagined. What had been, to him, a moment of moral clarity in the sky over Germany had shaped entire generations of lives. From that first meeting onward, Brown and Stigler maintained a close friendship that lasted 18 years. They spoke by telephone every week, traveled together, visited schools, and appeared at aviation gatherings to share their story. Their bond became a living example of reconciliation and humanity in wartime, a reminder that individual choices can transcend national divisions and shape the course of many lives long after the conflict has ended. In 2008, the story that had begun in the skies over Germany reached its quiet conclusion. Franz Stigler died first, on March 22nd, at the age of 92. 8 months later, on November 24th, Charlie Brown followed at 86. Their deaths, separated by only a short span of time, mirrored the rhythm of their lives after reunion, one always close behind the other, their bond intact until the very end. For those who knew their story, the timing felt symbolic. Two men, once enemies, had spent nearly 2 decades as brothers. It seemed fitting that their final departure from the world would come almost side by side. In the years after their reunion, their story spread beyond aviation circles and veteran communities. Historians, authors, and documentary filmmakers recognized its significance at a time when the Second World War was often remembered through its vast battles, destructive technologies, and political decisions. The encounter between Ye Old Pub and Franz Stigler offered something different, a moment where an individual chose humanity over violence in a setting defined almost entirely by violence. It demonstrated that the war, despite its scale, was still shaped by the decisions of individuals who could choose to act with moral courage even when the world expected otherwise. The story carried deeper meaning because it contrasted sharply with the environment in which it occurred. The air war over Europe was one of the most brutal theaters of the conflict. Pilots faced freezing temperatures, mechanical failures, and enemy fire on missions with staggering casualty rates. Within that environment, mercy was not merely unusual, it was dangerous. Stigler's decision risked his own life under German military law, which considered acts of deliberate leniency toward the enemy as potential treason. Yet he made that choice without hesitation, guided by personal principles rather than national directives. Charlie Brown's half-century of silence also became part of the story's legacy. He had been ordered not to speak of the encounter for reasons tied to morale and wartime psychology, but the cost of that silence was personal. For decades, he carried the burden of gratitude that had no outlet. When he finally found Stigler and learned the truth, it closed a chapter of his life that had remained unresolved since 1943. The reunion, and the friendship that followed, showed that even long after a war ends, healing can occur in ways that reshape how those who lived through it understand their past. The broader lesson that emerged from their story was simple yet profound. One act of mercy can echo for generations. Stigler's decision not only saved the surviving members of Ye Old Pub, but allowed their families to grow in the decades that followed. Children and grandchildren were born because of the 10 minutes in which a German fighter pilot refused to fire. The consequences extended far beyond the mission itself, shaping the lives of people who were not yet alive when the war took place. Today, their story stands as a reminder that even in the most destructive moments of history, humanity is not extinguished. It survives in individual choices, often small, often unseen, that contradict the expectations of conflict. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler lived long enough to see their story recognized, studied, and taught as evidence that moral courage can appear in the most unlikely of places. As their lives fade into the historical record, the meaning of their encounter remains. Two aircraft once flew side by side over Germany, united not by allegiance, but by a single decision. That moment, preserved through memory and testimony, continues to resonate, and as long as it is remembered, it offers a cinematic truth rooted in history. Even in war, a single human choice can outlive the noise of battle and carry its legacy into the distant future.